Yes, I can hear myself now. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming out to this episode of the Shakespeare Hour Live, kicking off our 23-24 season called Greater Wonders. We are live streaming this conversation on YouTube, so we also have virtual audience members, and we will be going live, I believe, right now. I'm getting the thumbs up. So I'm going to greet all of our online viewers as well. Welcome to the Shakespeare Hour Live. This episode, we are discussing Evita, the first show in our 23-24 season called Greater Wonders. And I am joined by a very exciting, very esteemed panel of guests who I will introduce now. I should also introduce myself. My name is Drew Lichtenberg. I'm an associate director at the Shakespeare Theatre Company. And sitting to my immediate left, your right, is Paula Alonso, who is an associate professor of history at the George Washington University and a native of Argentina. So a true expert in Argentine politics and culture and society. I can't wait to hear the true story about Eva Perón and Peronism. Sitting to Paula's left is Shereen Pimentel, who plays Evita in this production. Yes, applause. A truly stunning performance. Shereen is a graduate of the Juilliard Conservatory. She starred in the critically acclaimed revival of West Side Story on Broadway, playing Maria. She made her debut on Broadway in The Lion King at the age of 9, after being discovered where, Shereen?
Oh, I don't know that one, maybe.
Weren't you discovered at the...
Tell me.
Apollo Theater?
Oh, yeah. You are 100% right. That is where my audition was.
Sorry, we did a talk back last week, and you told this amazing story of performing at the Apollo Theater in Harlem and being discovered. A star was born.
I woke up at 6:30 this morning, so if I forget a few things, we had a student matinee, so
yes,
100% right.
Shereen is also an intrepid guest, having put in a very long day and a very vocally tiring day performing for a packed house of students.
Many students, yeah, it was really nice. It was really fun.
And they went completely nuts for the show, from what I heard.
They enjoyed it, and then they had a lot to say, and then we also had a talk back, and they had a lot of questions.
Ooh, spicy. So maybe we can get some of the student comments and questions for posterity for the live stream a little bit later. And finally, but certainly not least, Dr. Carla Della, Gatta, associate professor at the University of Maryland, College Park. Hello, Carla.
Hello, Drew.
And professor in the theater department, I should say. A brand new professor at University of Maryland, College Park.
Yes, it's been 4 weeks.
Yeah, so somebody who is brand new to DC, but not new to you, because Carla did, I think, 2 or 3 episodes, 3 episodes? During the pandemic on Zoom. I think you were saying this is the first time that you're wearing shoes.
I know.
For a taping of the Shakespeare Hour Live.
Thank you for sharing that.
So Paula, I think it would be great to start with you first, because we had a phone conversation prior to this where I convinced you to come join us. And you were saying that you were actually a teenager in 1978 or 79 when Evita was making its debut in London and then on Broadway. I think it opened in 79 on Broadway and won all the Tonys in 1980 and made Patti LuPone a star and Mandy Patinkin a star, and the rest was history. And you were telling me that this musical was actually taboo in Argentina. It was banned. You could not see this musical. Is that right?
You couldn't. So hello, everybody. It's lovely to be here. No, we couldn't see the show. I mean, many cultural artifacts were forbidden. This is under the last military dictatorship that ended in '83. And so I came here in a student exchange. I was 16, and the second we landed in New York, and the second night they took us to see Evita. I mean, a teenager seeing something forbidden, it was so much fun. And I have to say that until last week, when I came to see the show again, that was the only time I had seen the show. And so, yeah, it made me just think about that. And of course, I didn't think I was going to be a historian, live in the United States, be here tonight talking about the show. But most importantly, it made me reflect about my own country. This year, 2023, we are celebrating 40 years of consecutive democracy, and that's a great achievement for that. And so it made me think about that time, both on the show, the 40s and 50s, my own time coming here, was still under military dictatorship back home, and where we are today. So it was some good reflections to have.
And it's interesting to think about the fact that actually when Tim Rice and Andrew Lloyd Webber were composing Evita, it was during the period of the military dictatorship, which was immediately after kind of the second iteration of Peronism, after Juan Perón came back, right, in the 70s,
Right.
and died in office.
Yes.
So it's sort of this political moment immediately after one iteration of Peronism. And we were talking before the show about how there's multiple different Peronisms in Argentina. There's the period when Evita was alive,
Yes.
in the post-World War II era of the 40s and 50s. And then there's a second Peronism when Juan Perón comes back.
Well,
See, here I'm getting it wrong because I'm showing my Americanism,
There
right?
is-
But we tend to think of these as uncomplicated things, and it's actually a much more complicated history. So I wonder if you can orient us a little bit in what was Peronism, briefly,
Well-
in its original iteration.
I think if you ask 3 Argentines what is Peronism, what was Peronism, you get 5 different answers. And this is the most contested, researched, discussed, debated topic in our lives. But Peronism has a very long history, and the history of the show is what we now call the first Peronist experience. And that went from the military dictatorship of 43, 46, where Perón is sort of actually burst into history. Nobody knew him before 43. And so during that regime, he's going to build his power base and launch his bid to the presidency in 46. And so it was like, wow, out of nowhere. And so today, historians, when we look back and we research about those times, the first Peronism that ends in 55, then there's a second one that is, Perón is in exile. A third one when he comes back. and then this, Peronism and the democracy. Today the country is ruled by the Peronist party, at least until next month, where we're going to have presidential elections. So that first Peronism is the most researched and debated in many ways, not necessarily the most complicated, but as historians like to put it in context and look at traces of why Perón emerged and so forth. But I think what is more relevant, particularly for us and for the show, is to think how people lived that period. And so what Perón did, and Evita, both together, was to really divide the country and for the rest of the 20th century between Peronist and anti-Peronist. There was nothing in the middle. Because I was telling Drew, for those who lived at the time, you couldn't be indifferent to Peronism. Peronism was everywhere. And so those who opposed him, of course, tried to battle against him. But from the state, Perón also built a tremendous apparatus, and Evita was his main ally in doing this. And so both together built this tremendous power during his first presidency. So that is the first Peronism. How he came into power, I don't know if you want me to go into that.
Sure. I mean, I know that there were contested elections, and he was in the military, and it again complicated, right? But important context.
I think one way to simplify it is we place that experience within the larger international context. And we can remember, this is the Spanish Civil War, 36-39, the Second World War. And in that broad context, the world is divided between those who fight for democracy and liberal rights and authoritarian regimes. And we have to remember that in those who fought for democracy at the time, we have, Democrats, liberals, socialists, and communists. Before the Cold War, they were on this side of the equation. And so for many, when Perón begins to build his power during this military government, he's going to become the central figure in this regime. Those who oppose him sees him as authoritarianism, and those who oppose him are the ones who are fighting for democracy and bring the country back to democracy and the military regime, but also they don't want him because they identify him as the authoritarian figure. And so in that opposition to him, you also have the socialists and the communists. And then, of course, they have the Peronists. And so what Perón wants to build, he has a different vision for the country. And his own vision was something that it was not that unusual for the time. There were similar experiments in Mexico, in Brazil, where you will have a very powerful state who will control both the working class and the capital. And so in that way, you will avoid class clashes and the struggle of different social classes, but you also avoid communism. So he wants to build this sort of different way of building a state, a strong state. And the first base of his launch to the presidency is going to be the organized working class, which I was telling Drew that we define in Argentina the organized working class as factory workers who are unionized. And so he's going to make them powerful, and on the basis of that union strength, he's going to launch his bid to the presidency. Evita really did not have a role until she became First Lady. She wasn't a public figure. But oh my God, once she became First Lady, she really completely changed the role of First Lady. Generally used to be a very secondary role without much power, but she became extraordinarily powerful. And I don't know if you want me to talk about that too, or?
Well, I think this is a good chance to introduce Shereen into the conversation because, this was one of the things that I talked about a lot with Sammy, the director, is that, actually, Eva Perón used her position of power to, one, get women the right to vote in Argentine society. She was very strongly associated with the working classes, beloved by the working classes. She founded charitable organizations, right? It's not as simple as saying, well, she was on the side of authoritarianism or she was a handmaiden to autocracy. And, in America, we think of union labor groups as being on the side of the left and not on the side of the authoritarians. So we don't have a great context for this. Right. And I remember going in 2018 to City Center, the production of Evita in New York, which you were not in, Shereen, but what was so striking about this reinterpretation of the piece was it recentered or refocused on the woman, Eva Perón, instead of the kind of icon, right? I think Rice and Lloyd Webber have a lot of fun with the theatricality of authoritarianism, right? And the ways in which celebrity is used to make a political appeal. There's a very theatrical quality to the figure of Evita with the pearls and the hair and the flowers.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was not in the City Center production, but I was actually able to watch it. I was in West Side Story at the time, and it was kind of the talk of the town at that time because there hadn't been a major production in New York that was kind of mounting in this way in a long time. So when I saw it, I was struck by the grandeur of the piece. And as you said, the pearls and the flowers and the white ball gown and the costume design that many of y'all have seen. I have about like 11 or 12 costumes all in white. And everyone else is dressed in grayscale. So a lot of that conversation of grandeur hits you when you first experience the piece. Then COVID happened, life changes. There is the announcement that the show is going to happen. I get an audition, I audition for it, book the show, and I thought, my, oh me, oh my, that's a very large undertaking because it isn't a history that I knew anything about other than the musical, which I think is like so common in America. You know, we see a musical and something that spans such a long period of time is so grand. We take that and we're like, there it is. We know the thing. 2 hours. I've got the whole story. Done. And so when I booked it, I thought, well, I do need to know more than just 2 hours of this story. And so I started to really try to deep dive as much as I could into history and facts. And there's still no way I'll know as much as you do. I'm even sitting here being like, oh yes, okay, interesting, good to know. But I started to deep dive into her life and what just the broad overscale of like who she was and what did she do, where'd she come from, what were the main points of just even what's highlighted in the show, her foundation, the ability to vote. Sammy really does talk about that of Eva really championing women voting and trying to make sure in New Argentina that it's very clear that women can't vote at that time so that audiences are able to experience as much as you can history, again, as much as you can so that you can go home and do your own research as well. And so that's where, for me at least, the process of starting the show began. Before I booked it, I thought, I should do some research. And I did. And then also just talking to Sammy and talking about her vision for the show. It's written by two men. Lovely. It's a lovely piece. But having, I think, a woman's perspective on it was something that Sammy is excited about and I'm excited about. And then we have a female choreography team and many women looking at the piece and trying to see what are other things that you can unearth from it. Because as you said, it premiered in the 70s. And you know as much as you know at that time. But we're in 2023, and now we know as much as we know now. And so how can we incorporate the knowledge that we have gained over time into the piece and into our understanding of what this person's life could have been like because we didn't live at that time, and how much we can try to get to a truth of it so that we don't leave with like, I know these 2 hours, but then you have someone who knows a lot more and you're like, I did not know that actually. So that was a big piece of where we kept going.
Yeah, it's something that we encounter very often in Shakespeare where there's a tension between the theatrical myth or iconography and then the real humanity of the story,
yes.
Right? And often when those two things are actually working together is when you have something special. Yeah. Which brings me to you, Carla, because you are also the author of Latinx Shakespeare's, staging U.S. intercultural theater from Michigan University Press, and the editor of a collection titled Shakespeare and Latinidad. So you are an expert on Shakespeare as well as Latinidad and intracultural theater.
Yes.
And it's one of the questions that gets posed to me is, oh, you're the Shakespeare Theater Company, and you're doing Evita. Mm-hmm. This seems Shakespearean, but how is it Shakespearean? Wow. Not to put you on the spot necessarily.
But you did.
Right.
Hello, hi, I'm Carla. There's a lot to say about that. And what you were saying about how I think a lot of us, as Americans, a lot of us know what we know about British kings through Shakespeare. So, and I mean, really, most of what I know about Richard II and Richard III has to do with how Shakespeare wrote them. And this is, when we talk about, usually when we're talking, I'm Colombian and I work on Latinx theater, and I'm on the steering committee for the Latinx Theater Commons. And one of the terms that's used that actually came from the creators of the show Fresh Off the Boat is called rep sweats, or representation sweats, when you sweat the representation of your group, because there isn't a lot of representation. And so the stakes are different for communities that are not often represented on stage or in film or anywhere else than for those that often are. And when it comes to characters, real life people, marginalized communities, if you only have one or two stories about them, then that's the story that carries weight. And so there can be a greater amount of importance. That being said, this is musical theater, so they do break out into song a lot. And so our ideas about realism and history, I'm like, you're singing and all the time and dancing. So that we have to negotiate a little bit of that. So when we come to the theater for our history, we've got to take it a little bit with a grain of salt, right? That being said, going back, musical theater history with Rodgers and Hammerstein, kind of the golden era of musicals. Then we start to get the book musical, as they call it. Think West Side Story, 1957, and where there's a story, and when the characters have so much emotion, they break out into song to express that emotion. And the book musical, we think of West Side Story, Carousel, Oklahoma, and typically music will disappear from the last part of that musical to wrap up the story, to make the narrative complete. And West Side Story kind of marks the triple threat of what we need of our performers who can act and sing and dance. Then we start to get in our civil rights movements and our post-civil rights sensibilities more political action on stage. So where Evita comes about is strangely from a concept album. Like this was not supposed to be a musical originally. And Evita, I don't really like this phrase, but it's just kind of true, was a bit ahead of its time in that sense, in taking on a political charge, a very grand figure in history, and some people have referred to this type of thing as the mega musical, right? Where there's less of a story, but more of an idea or a concept or a feeling that you want to create. And they're bigger visually, there's spectacle, and they're about characters or real people that are larger than life. And I think that's where the connection for me comes in with Shakespeare, that part of it is that the musical or the Shakespearean play makes the historical figure into something bigger than they were. And part of it is that the play or the musical only happens because that figure was significant to begin with. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg thing, right? And so when that comes along, we get this moment with Evita where before that we had several musicals that were pushing on the visual, like A Chorus Line and Chicago, and kind of things that were pushing in that way. What will follow when Andrew Lloyd Webber goes big, we're going to get Starlight Express, and then Cats, and then Phantom of the Opera, and we've got swinging chandeliers and all sorts of things that are happening. But this was quite different than the American musical going on at the time. Hal Prince, the producer, had partnered already with Stephen Sondheim on Company, which, if you're familiar with that musical, you've got to pay attention, and there's some really serious things going on, right? And what starts to happen in American musical theater is that push on politics, where Andrew Lloyd Webber comes in and sometimes was critiqued, was just for, let me just give you spectacle. But with Evita, that precedes that, he's taking on a political subject, and some people may miss the critique that's absolutely very much there, right? And Hal Prince was a political producer and political director, and that comes about with it as well. So I think that the historical figure and the care and critique that's going into that is important in all the stagings of Evita.
Yeah, I mean, you certainly, following up on that, Carla, thank you. You certainly see that in this production where there are moments where the entire stage will be the flag of Argentina or Franco's Spain. And what's being gestured at is something offstage that happened in history across an entire country and across years, decades of historical time, not in a dissimilar way to a Shakespearean history play. There's a complex relationship between the theatrical iconography of what's being embodied on stage and this idea of a historical dramaturgy. Not that it's a docudrama in any way, it's very theatrical.
And what Evita does with time, it draws out certain moments and then just jumps ahead, is what the playwright Paula Vogel calls epic narrative or Shakespearean narrative, where the action moves forward and then you pause. There's a monologue, to be or not to be, and then the action moves forward and there's a pause, another monologue. And it's what the scholar Emma Smith calls gaps or gappiness, right? Where the action's forward and then there's a gap. Evita is almost like a review, and it moves forward with music, but you take this time period where Eva Duarte is making a name for herself in Buenos Aires, and they just sum up that period in, 3 minutes in a song? Goodbye and thank you. You're like, whoa, wasn't that a decade? And so that moves very quickly. You're like, we'll just skip over that. And that's kind of the way time can work in Shakespeare as well. You're like, okay. And yeah, as you're all familiar with Shakespeare plays, you're like, did we miss a period? We'll just gloss over that because it doesn't really work with the dramaturgy. And that's, again, where the spectacle or the story or the concept, the theatricality is more important than engaging all these historical moments accurately.
Yeah, I mean, the Shakespeare play Evita reminds me of is The Winter's Tale, which is another play that focuses on the body of a dead woman and allows that woman to be resurrected through the suspension of disbelief, right? So when she's singing Don't Cry for Me, Argentina, it's sort of Lloyd Webber's version of the statue scene, where Hermione comes back to life in The Winter's Tale. Speaking of coming back to life, this musical ends in a very abrupt, surprising way, where the character of Che, who we may talk about, says, oh yeah, and then her body disappears for 17 years after she dies. End of play. And the audiences are always like, what? And 17 years actually is the gap of time that Perdita in The Winter's Tale spends away from Sicily, right? That's a weird connection of history and dramaturgy. But Paula, you said, you are the expert here. Why did Evita's body disappear for such a long period of time? And what is the significance politically of this missing body?
It was huge. It was really big. So let's put a little bit things in context. So she dies in 52, just after Perón starts his second presidency. And then Perón is ousted in 55 by another military government. And then there is a problem in Argentina, which is what to do with Peronism. And then what to do with Evita. So Evita is embalmed, as everybody knows. The idea was that a huge mausoleum was going to be built for her, and that did not happen. And so what to do with Peronism is going to really destabilize the country for the next decade. So the 1960s for us was a tremendous decade. In many countries, but particularly for us, I would say. And here, everybody needs to adjust. So the non-Peronists have to try to come to reality that if you have free elections, Peronists will win, and they don't want that. Peronists have to come to the reality that their leader is in exile, and it's not clear if he's going to be able to come back. And then it's Perón himself, who he does want to come back, and so he's going to be really active from his many exile homes, and mostly he's going to end up in Madrid. And so all that sort of was a really difficult cocktail for the country to deal with. So different governments try to deal with that with different ways, generally repressing Peronism, not allowing Peronism to participate in elections, or participate partially, or if they participated, they did well, then they nullify the elections, then we have another military government. So it was the whole, what to do with Peronism became really a problem. And so in the midst of all that, we have Evita's body. So, which had tremendous symbolic power. And so the idea is to make it less visible, and so to hide her. And so they send the body to a secret tomb in a secret cemetery in Milan, in Italy.
As one does, you know.
I know, what a story, you know, it's just. So, and then Peronism at home is fragmented. There are the trade union leaders who want to build Peronism without Perón, those who want to be loyal to Perón, and then we're going to have new actors, which are the left. So now we're going to have the Peronist left. And most of them are going to choose guerrilla fighting because we have the Cuban Revolution impact in Latin America and in us. And so they're going to think that if Perón comes back, he's going to be the Fidel Castro of Argentina, which he never wanted to be. But he let them believe that it was for his interest. And so, and everybody claims the body. They all want, all the different factions of Peronism want the body and demand the body. Her mother also demands her body because she wants to bury her daughter in a normal cemetery. So all the different factions say that the heirs of Evita, well, she was first lady, she had a very sort of more combative stand. She was the one who was fighting for the descamisados, much more than Perón in her language and her speech. So people say she was more Jacobin than Perón himself. And so in that fighting period of the 60s, well, some want Perón to come back, others don't want him to come back, and then the guerrilla fighters want him to come back to the social revolution. They all then claim of Evita as the fighter, and so she becomes this important symbol for them. And then there's also a lot of gossip. So the new magazines in the industries in the 60s that emerged, copying Time and Newsweek. We have our local versions. And there was a lot of gossip of, oh, we think that the body is somewhere. I said, oh, we think somebody saw the body. And so there's going to be all this fiction around the body as well, the secret and the fiction, and also the political battles for the body. Eventually, in 1971, the body is going to be given back to Perón in Madrid as a gesture of conciliation. Argentines realized that, well, those who could not live with Perón now realize they cannot live without him. People want him to come back and pacify the country because the country is, a mess. And so he's giving the body back in this gesture of conciliation. And then he comes back to Argentina. He doesn't bring the body with him. So he comes back, he's elected president, he dies in office in 1974. But the body is going to eventually come back during the presidency of his third wife. Evita was the second wife. I don't know if people know that.
And also Perón was twice her age when they met, I believe. Yes. I think she was in her early 20s and he was in his 40s when they met.
He was born in 1895, and she was born in 1919. Yeah, so right. She was much younger than him. And so basically, eventually the body comes back in 74 and is buried in the Recoleta cemetery where he is today, which is an odd place to have Evita's body because that is the posh cemetery of the nation. So the members of the elite are buried there. So why the fighter of the descamisados is buried there with the members of the elite that she despised? I was not very clear, but that's where she is at the moment.
And Shereen, your relationship with Juan in the play seems to be very much a real marriage built on mutual trust and respect and love. Yeah, so
one of the conversations when we first started looking at the piece between us three, me, Sammy, and Caesar, we spoke about how do we actually feel that the relationship went in real life, like based off of facts of the fact that like Perón did end up with her body. And like to me that was something that I was like, for someone to receive her body back and keep her, I was like, maybe there's love. And then Caesar was reading some of the letters that he had written in exile about her and all these different things. And we ended in a place of there was true love between these two people. Whether that's true or not, again, it's theater. There's, as we like to call it, the fiction of the story, and that's what we go off of as actors. Like, that's the fiction I've made up, and I'm gonna go with it. But what we wanted to depict is that through power, through them rising, through all of these things happening, at the core of it is a relationship that is two people who love each other but are mutually benefiting from each other. So, she's benefiting from wanting power, and he has her there, and she's able to speak this rhetoric and is able to amass so many people behind him as he rises to power and becomes president. So yeah, that was our focus.
And hearing you talk, Paula, about the 60s and the revolutions in Cuba, I mean, this is the real era of Che Guevara, of Ernesto Guevara. And one of the interesting things, Carla, is that I think you mentioned Hal Prince. He's the one who, according to theatrical fable, introduces this narrator character of Che, who kind of serves as a left-wing critic in the play of Evita.
Absolutely. And we were talking earlier, and I was saying there seems to be some revisionist history amongst musical theater scholars that now the take on it oftentimes is Che, which is like in Argentine Spanish a way of saying like mate or dude, right? Is kind of like an everyman, right? And but it was Hal Prince who wanted that critique, who wanted Che Guevara, and there was no evidence that he ever met Eva Perón. Like, that wouldn't make any sense. And it can be viewed as a bit of homogenizing different histories of Latin American countries. Like, Che Guevara, he's famous, and Eva Perón, she's pretty famous, and let's just put them in the musical, right?
These are two famous people from Argentina that we know existed in the 20th century.
Well, let's just have them on stage together, right? So there's that, and a bit of a problem. But also, yes, Hal Prince's idea was that he wanted a character to critique what was going on, so that in this beautiful spectacle and wonderful music, it didn't start to glamorize a dictatorship that could be associated with, autocracy and associated with fascism in some cases, as it was. And so to have a Che Guevara figure on stage, he functions as kind of a neo-Brechtian commentary. So in the theater of Bertolt Brecht, right, in being able to have almost a meta-theatrical interlocutor, that there's someone up there kind of, not that we would get lost in the reality of what's going on stage in Evita, but that there's someone there to kind of comment on that and to keep that distance for the audience. And so if you're not quite sure you get taken away with the beauty and the staging and the music and the costuming and the spectacle, that there's someone there to help kind of guide your audience. So what starts to happen in the 1980s is with the United States various relationships with Central and South American countries, the character of Che starts to become kind of an everyman and less the Mandy Patinkin in very Che Guevara outfits, and you just start to see Che on stage. And then in the 1996 film, yes, I just mentioned the film, with Madonna and Antonio Banderas, that just solidified kind of a major shift in how Che was staged, because Banderas in the film very much kind of moves into different roles and is a waiter here and is this person there and is not dressed in the jacket or the fatigues or anything else. So you have a very different interpretation in the film that I think is the result of politics and theater in the 1980s and 90s up to that.
And in this production, it's really fascinating. In the talk back, hearing the actor talk about the development of that character, it was based on two figures, one of whom was part of this embalming or disappearance of the body after Perón's deposition, who was very connected to Evita. So this idea of the play, it becomes, in this production, a kind of memory play with the Che character remembering this fraught and contested period of history. Which I don't think has been done before with this play, and is fascinating. We could talk about this all day, but you are here, and also people online are online watching us. Do we have any questions or comments for our brilliant panel of guests? Yes, do we have any comments from the live stream?
Not yet.
Not yet? Well, please fire away if you're watching online. Yes, anyone here? Yes, sir.
We wanted to thank you for including the timeline in the program because it wasn't what we thought.
So I've been thanked for including for working on the timeline and including that in the program. It's not what you thought. What do you mean by that, sir?
It spans more time from the 30s to 70. And but one thing that struck us about the period and about Eva's rise is that she's described as a radio figure. And actually on the way home we were talking about radio figures of the 30s and the 40s, from Father Coughlin to FDR. And we were wondering, what was she doing on the radio?
Yeah, so this is a historical fact that Eva Perón was a model actor on stage and screen, and also had her own radio program where she campaigned for Perón. And it is true that in the 30s, radio was this new technology that you could argue helped politicians broadcasting in a new way, reaching people in a more direct way, like Father Coughlin in America, like someone named Adolf Hitler in Germany. Like if Hitler was on TV, my theory is he was such a funny looking dude, it never would have worked, right? Radio was key, just like social media maybe with Trump was key. So it's fascinating. Paula, to hear from you, was Eva's charisma over the radio a crucial aspect of her appeal?
Before she became First Lady? Well, she was, I mean, let's go back. So, yes, she moves to Buenos Aires to become an actress, and she does achieve some relevance, but she wasn't a movie star by any, she was in one film that it didn't show. So she was in radio novelas, as we call them, but she wasn't really a big star, let's say like that. But the radio was really relevant for Perón's campaign, and because let's remember that he comes from the military and a military government. He launches his bid to the presidency in October 1945. The elections are in mid-February 1946. He doesn't have a political party. So he has to build his base very quickly. Of course, the trade union leadership helps with that, but he has to be known throughout the country. And so the radio here was key for him in popularizing himself. Not so much Evita. I mean, she was with him during the campaign. They got married very quickly in October just to start the presidential campaign. But she wasn't the big star yet. In fact, when she became First Lady and Perón asked her to speak in front of audiences, initially people did not want her. They said, no, well, we want him. We came for him. We don't. Well, who is this person? And of course, very quickly, she was very smart and very charismatic. So very quickly, she learned how to gain, support in many different areas that Shereen discussed. But it was after she became First Lady, mostly her role, not necessarily before.
Interesting. So radio crucial in the campaign, but then after she became the star. Yes?
What, if any, impact did you feel from having a woman of color playing Eva?
You mean like me playing Eva? Yeah. So it's new. It's different. I really enjoy being able to take on the role because it is a story about a real life person. I know I do not look like that real life person. I am aware of that. But I think that when we put musicals on stage, we have the ability to talk about the history of the show in which we're putting on, and then also to talk about conversations that we should just be having on an everyday basis. And so the conversation, I think, of colorism within the Latin community is something that I really want to have, especially in theater and also within everyday life. So I'm Afro-Latina, and within my life, I've had people who very quickly say, pick a side, pick one side or another, which isn't possible. Within the family that I grew up in, I grew up with truly every single part of it, and at the same time grew up in the suburbs of New Jersey. You know, like there are so many parts of the culture I have at home, and then also just the upbringing that I have. So I would never pick one. Every single part of me is there. So when people walk away, I do hope that it does span another conversation outside of just the history or different parts of Argentine culture, that we also have this conversation about things within musical theater and within the world. Yeah, thank you.
Charlie, and then Eric, and then you, ma'am. Yeah.
Last week I was in New York, and I happened to have seen another Broadway musical that also has a central character who is female and, historical. Here Lies Love.
Yes.
And both shows, and I saw your show last night, both shows struck me as glamorizing and asking us to empathize with this central character, whereas perhaps we should be asked to condemn and expose her, in both cases, self-centeredness.
Sure.
So the question for those online who can't hear, for those in the front, is Here Lies Love, which is a musical on Broadway right now, which I saw 10 years ago at the Public Theater, which is about Imelda Marcos in the Philippines. And you were saying that the show's may be inviting us to empathize with these political figures from history, and your opinion, your stance is that perhaps we should be asked to condemn these figures from political history.
Yeah, so, sure. So, as we talk about the show, when we first started looking at it, we wanted to look at the fact that we start the show with a girl who's 15 years old. And as you said, like, Eva didn't run away with Magaldi. Like, that is not a historical fact, but based off of the show and how it is framed, that is who she ends up with, an Argentine singer who was significantly older than her. And so when we first sat in the room, we talked about, could a 15-year-old consent to something like that? And as we would all say, no. So she ends up with this man, ends up in Buenos Aires, ends up having men kind of circle and take advantage of her. And one of the things that we talked about within that advantage that's taken is she would, again, within the fiction of trying to figure out someone else's mind and the history of it, she would learn a behavior and reflect it as she continues to go through life. And so that's how we framed the beginning of the show, to say. Then she ends up meeting Perón, ends up rising to power, and she was a fighter for the descamisados. And our thought was that she was there for the working class, fighting for this working class, trying to get something for them, trying to get them position, trying to get them power, something, and rose to this place and ends up, the power could overtake her. What happened? We don't know, right? Because I don't sit inside her mind to be able to say, like, the power overtook her and she became kind of greedy for power and money and all of these things. Very well possibly could have happened. I don't know. There's the possibility that she was trying for all these people. And then there's also the place somewhere in the middle that all of it is true. Right. That she did get wrapped up in the power, and she did also try to help the people. And so to then skip all the way to the end of the musical, we get to I'm standing on the apron of the front of the stage, and Che is there, and I sing the lament of, you remember I was very young then, and the choice was mine and mine completely. So meaning that all the choices that I made them. Right, wrong, or indifferent, I made them. I was very young at the time in which I made them, and I didn't know what I was doing, possibly, or I did. But I hope you can understand what I did, not so that you empathize with me, but so that you can understand that there's a possibility that she had flaws and she was human. I like to, and all of that to say, that the simple tagline I like to put on the version that we're at least doing of this is, if you've ever, I'm a big Disney fan, if you've ever seen the Maleficent movie, you see Sleeping Beauty first. And Maleficent is the villain of the story. And then you watch the Maleficent movie and you go, oh, there were all these things that happened in her life. Doesn't mean she did the right thing. Doesn't mean she's not still the villain. There was other things that happened, and I as the person reconcile with someone's humanity. That, I think that's really what we're trying to leave you with more, is reconciling with people's humanity, not telling you to glorify the person, because we really did, especially when we got here, as we were doing adjustments to the show, Sammy had said actually one very specific day of like, I don't want anyone to be specifically leaving with, this is a saint. I don't want one person specifically leaving with, this is the villain. I want you to go home and grapple with the feelings that you feel inside. So that's a very long answer to like that.
Well, thank you, Shereen. And I would also add to that is a Shakespearean principle, right? We're just right now on our rehearsal studio on Capitol Hill. Patrick Page is there rehearsing All the Devils Are Here, his one-man show, where he plays all of Shakespeare's villains from Richard III basically to Prospero. And he was saying this afternoon that Shakespeare, in writing these villains, undergoes a change in his writing as a playwright, and also changes us as human beings in how we understand what humanity is. And Richard III probably has no relationship to the historical Richard III, who might have been a nice guy, right? Maybe Henry VII kills the princess in the tower, like Josephine Tay would argue. But we are compelled by Richard III doing these things that we find inexplicable and difficult. And there is a humanity in Richard III that is undeniable, even though we can't imagine a monster like that could ever happen in history, even though that play predicts the rest of the next 400 years of human history, right? And the ability to have that conversation about Eva Perón and Evita is, I think, us doing our job as a Shakespeare theater.
Yeah, and I just really quickly, also, I think it's the conversation of like, it's song and dance for 2 hours. Like, I hope that we're not trying to rewrite history, right? Yeah. Like, there are people who really lived in that time, live in the aftermath of that time. I can never speak on what the people in that country go through now or went through at that time or any of that. But I think for an American audience to watch the show and to leave with a conversation of humanity, and also to then start to see it within our own politics, because we started to talk about that in our own room of, have we ever had political figures who have, with their rhetoric, divided the country?
Well, and the paradox you were saying, Paula, of if you have a popular election, can the authoritarian party win, right? Which is a real problem we have in America right now. If we have an election coming up, oh my God, it's happening soon. I do want to get to the other two questions that we had, though, and there's also a comment from online. So, ma'am, in the green hair, I believe you had a question?
That must be me.
Yes.
This is really a question about the structure of the play. This was the first time we've ever seen Evita. And there's this very strange little pocket where she comes with Perón and she kicks his mistress out of the house. And that little person has her own number. She doesn't have a name. And I just wondered, I had my own thoughts about the function that was being served there, but it felt texturally different from the rest, and I wondered what thoughts.
So a dramaturgy question, I love it, about the song for the mistress.
And I'm so thrilled that you asked about that, because that song is there really just to give the actress playing Evita a break.
And I appreciate it.
Right. I mean,
so you're saying it's like the Claudius Laertes scene in Act 4 of Hamlet.
There is no historical recollection of that.
And no, truly, that's why it's there, because of the demands of the show vocally, and that is why it is there. In the film version, they give that song to Madonna because she was Madonna, and so you have to do that, right? But that is in fact why that song is there, because you need that reprieve because it's music. It's not the book musical where you get into a lot of dialogue and start to sing again. The music is carrying everything through, so that's a vocal reprieve.
But what is interesting about what Sammy does,
so the first iteration that we had at ART was not the version that you saw. That version was actually more of the mistress, Naomi, almost as if she was writing in a diary, which I think is a version that has been done before. Sammy at least did it at City Center, where she's down with her suitcase, recounting these things, pulling out pieces from the suitcase, looking at them. This version that you saw, it was a retelling almost, or restaging-ish, the word, of Good Night and Thank You. And the reason that Sammy had done that version when we spoke about it was Good Night and Thank You has a lot of, I think, humor to it. It can, just kind of the idea of this revolving door of men. And Sammy wanted to show you the mirroring of it while sucking out all of that and see what it could have actually been. There is the humor version and the very realistic and serious kind of version of what Ava could have been going through at that time. And in City Center, there was a young Ava, and so they had the ability to use young Ava and see her that gap that you have between Buenos Aires and Good Night and Thank You, all those years, being able to use another suitcase a little bit to show what young Ava would have been going through. Since we don't have a young Ava, we were able to use the mistress and to tell that story.
The focus on women's experience, on women's lives, I think is such a keystone of this production.
And I also had the thought that because the suitcase motif comes from Goodbye and Thank You, and then you see it again, but this time it's Ava who's the victimizer. That's right. She's like, get out.
Exactly.
Right, the suitcase becomes a motif, a visual motif that is threaded through amongst these various female characters in the play. And it's a cycle that keeps repeating itself, the abuse of women.
And you don't totally like her at that moment.
Right.
She's like, I'm the mistress now, get out.
Online, do we have a comment, question online?
We sure do. So Karen in the live chat has a follow-up question about Eva's body. And she is curious which group actually moved her to Milan and then to Madrid.
Thank you, Karen Online. Hi, Karen Online. Paula, what group moved her to Madrid and then Milan and then Madrid?
It was the military who gave Perón back the body. So it was in 71, and the elections are going to be in 73. So it's the last military government before he comes back to power. The body from Madrid to Buenos Aires is a different story. It's quite. It looks our country look very weird about bodies, and so forth. But the Peronist guerrilla movement, the largest one, was called Montoneros, and one of the main acts they did was they killed the main president of the military government that ousted Perón in 55. So assassinated him. So they stole his body from the cemetery to press the government to say, okay, I'll give you the body back if you give me Evita's body back and you bring Evita back to Argentina. So I know it makes us look so bad, this story. Believe me, we are normal people. We've had democracy for 40 years, as I said. But those were really difficult times. And so that is, those were the people who were responsible for the movements of the body at that stage.
And if you're curious about seeing what happens to the body, our friends over at Gala Hispanic Theater on 14th Street are doing a play called Mummy in the Closet later this year that begins right where Evita leaves off and tells the story of the disappeared body in the 17 years. So that's my plug. Go in May, go to Columbia Heights and see Mummy in the Closet. It's been a wonderful Shakespeare Hour Live. I want to thank our amazing panel. I learned so much hearing all three of you talk. I also want to thank all of you in this room and all of you online for tuning in. Our next episode is, I believe, October 17th, where we will be discussing 18th, where we will, thank you, Hillary, we will be discussing Macbeth in Stride, a fabulous new play by Whitney White, STC Associate Director. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.